My name is Marcus Johnson, and from 2016 to 2018, I was the overnight janitor at a private recording studio in Chicago's South Side. The building was unremarkable from the outside, an old converted warehouse that housed several creative spaces. But one tenant made the entire building feel different: Kanye West. This wasn't just any studio rental for Kanye. This was his sanctuary, his creative laboratory where he'd disappear for days at a time working on what would become some of his most controversial and disturbing music. The locals knew it as Ye's Spot, and there was an unspoken understanding that you didn't mess with whatever happened inside those walls. I got the job through a temp agency in late 2016. The pay was excellent for custodial work, almost suspiciously generous, and the requirements were simple. Clean the entire building between midnight and 6 a.m., don't disturb any equipment or recordings, and most importantly, don't ask questions about what you see or hear. That last rule should have been a red flag, but I needed the work. The building had 3 floors, the main recording levels on 1 and 2, and a basement that I was explicitly told was off limits. Storage and electrical, my supervisor explained. Dangerous for non-technical personnel. Stay upstairs and do your job. For the first few months, everything seemed normal. I'd arrive at midnight, clean the common areas, empty trash, mop floors, and maintain the equipment areas. Sometimes I'd encounter Kanye or his crew still working, and they were always professional, focused on their music but respectful of my work. But I started noticing patterns that didn't make sense. Kanye's studio sessions were becoming increasingly erratic. He'd arrive in the early evenings seeming normal, energetic, creative. But as the night progressed, his behavior would shift dramatically. Through the studio's glass windows, I could see him becoming agitated, paranoid, even talking to empty corners of the room as if someone was there. The music itself was changing too. I'm not a musician, but I've worked around recording studios long enough to recognize different moods and styles. Kanye's earlier work had been brilliant, innovative, uplifting even when dealing with serious topics. But the tracks I'd overhear during my cleaning shifts were different, darker, more disturbing, with lyrics that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. And then there were the sounds from the basement. It started around February 2017. As I cleaned the upper floors, I'd hear noises coming from below, not mechanical sounds like you'd expect from electrical equipment, but something organic. Scratching, whispering, and occasionally what sounded like chanting in languages I didn't recognize. When I mentioned it to my supervisor, he brushed off my concerns. Old building, weird acoustics. Don't worry about it. But the sounds were getting louder, more frequent, and they seemed to correspond with Kanye's increasingly bizarre behavior during his studio sessions. One night in March 2017, I was cleaning the hallway outside Kanye's main recording room when I heard him having an intense conversation with someone. The problem was, I'd watched his crew leave hours earlier, and I hadn't seen anyone else enter the building. "I gave you what you asked for," Kanye was saying, his voice strained and desperate. "The energy, the creativity, the influence over my fans. But I can't keep doing this. It's changing me into something I don't recognize." There was no response that I could hear, but Kanye continued as if someone was speaking to him. "No, I won't bring you more artists. Find someone else to corrupt. I want out of this deal." A long pause, then Kanye's voice became frightened. "You can't make me. I still have my own will. I still have control over my own mind. What happened next still haunts me. Kanye let out a scream of pain that echoed through the entire building, followed by sobbing. When I risked looking through the studio window, he was on the floor, holding his head as if something was trying to get inside it. That's when I realized the conversation wasn't with another person. It was with whatever lived in the basement. Over the following months, I watched Kanye's transformation accelerate. He'd arrive at the studio looking normal, but within hours, his entire demeanor would change. His eyes would become unfocused, his speech patterns would shift, and he'd start creating music that seemed to channel something dark and ancient. The basement sounds grew stronger too, and I began to understand that they corresponded directly with Kanye's creative output. When he was working on particularly intense or controversial lyrics, the scratching and whispering from below would become almost deafening. I started paying closer attention to the building's layout, and I discovered something that changed everything. There was a basement entrance I'd never been shown. Hidden behind a false wall in a storage closet was a staircase leading down into darkness. In April 2017, my curiosity finally overcame my caution. During a particularly quiet night when Kanye wasn't in the building, I decided to explore the forbidden basement. The staircase was older than the rest of the building, made of stone rather than the modern materials used in the upper floors. As I descended, the temperature dropped noticeably, and I could smell something that reminded me of incense mixed with decay. The basement was much larger than it should have been, extending far beyond the building's footprint above. The walls were covered with symbols and writing that looked like a mixture of different ancient languages, some carved into the stone, others painted in what looked suspiciously like dried blood. But the centerpiece of the room was what made me understand the true horror of the situation. In the center of the basement was a circular altar made of black stone, surrounded by candles that burned with an unnatural flame that gave off no smoke. The altar was covered with music equipment, turntables, mixing boards, microphones, but they were old, antique pieces that looked like they'd been there for decades, and floating above the altar, barely visible but definitely present, was something that defied description. It looked like a shadow with shape, a darkness that moved with purpose and intelligence. When it noticed me, I felt its attention like a physical weight pressing down on my mind. That's when I heard its voice, not through my ears, but directly in my thoughts. "Another musician comes to serve," it said, and I realized it thought I was there to make some kind of deal. "What do you offer in exchange for talent, for fame, for influence over the minds of millions?" I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The entity continued, "Your friend upstairs has served well, but he grows resistant. His mind fights against our influence. Perhaps you would be more cooperative." Images flooded my mind, visions of musical success, screaming crowds, wealth beyond imagination. But underneath the glamorous surface, I could see the truth. Artists throughout history, their creativity slowly drained until they became empty vessels for this thing's dark influence. "Musicians have always needed inspiration," the entity explained. "We provide it in exchange for access. Access to their creativity, their platform, their ability to influence human consciousness. Some serve willingly, others must be convinced." I saw flashes of other musicians, other studios, other basements like this one. A network of supernatural influence that had been shaping popular music for decades, using artists as conduits to spread its influence into human culture. "Your Kanye West was particularly useful," it continued. "His platform, his ego, his willingness to speak controversial truths, perfect for our purposes. But he has become difficult, resistant to our guidance. That's when I understood what I'd been witnessing. Kanye's increasingly erratic behavior, his controversial statements, his apparent mental health struggles, they weren't entirely his own. He was fighting against supernatural influence that had been growing stronger over time. The entity showed me visions of Kanye's original deal, a young, ambitious musician desperate for success, unknowingly making contact with forces that offered him everything he wanted in exchange for gradually surrendering his autonomy. He thought he was just making music, the entity explained. He didn't understand that creativity and consciousness are connected, that influencing one allows control over the other. By the time he realized the true cost, the connection was too strong to break. I saw the progression, how Kanye's early success had come with supernatural enhancement, how his growing fame had provided the entity with access to millions of minds through his music, and how the arrangement had gradually evolved from partnership to possession. But resistance has consequences, the entity continued, and I saw visions of what would happen to artists who tried to break free from their bargains. Mental breakdowns, career destruction, public humiliation, all tools used to maintain control. Your friend will serve until we no longer need him, it concluded. Then we'll find another. Perhaps you. I managed to break free from the entity's mental grip and ran up the stairs, but the damage was done. I'd seen too much, understood too much. The building, the studio, the entire setup was designed to facilitate supernatural influence over popular music. For the remaining months of my employment, I watched Kanye's situation deteriorate. His public statements became increasingly bizarre and controversial. His behavior suggested someone fighting a battle inside his own mind. The music he produced during this period was unlike anything in his earlier catalog. Darker, more aggressive, filled with references to power, control, and spiritual warfare. But I also saw signs of his resistance. Sometimes, in quieter moments, the real Kanye would surface. He'd create music that sounded like his authentic voice, or make statements that seemed to come from his actual beliefs rather than supernatural influence. The entity in the basement grew frustrated with his resistance, and the supernatural pressure on him intensified. During his final months at the studio, I'd see him arrive looking exhausted and defeated, as if he was fighting a constant internal battle. In late 2018, Kanye stopped coming to the studio entirely. I later learned he'd moved his operations elsewhere, apparently trying to escape whatever had been influencing him from that basement. That I quit the job shortly afterward. I couldn't continue working in a building that I knew was being used to corrupt and control human creativity. The pay wasn't worth being complicit in supernatural manipulation of popular culture. But the experience taught me to recognize the signs of supernatural influence in the music industry. The sudden personality changes, the controversial statements that seem to come from somewhere else, the music that channels darkness rather than authentic human experience. I believe Kanye West was a victim of supernatural predation that uses the music industry as a hunting ground. These entities seek out talented, ambitious artists and offer them success in exchange for gradual control over their creativity and consciousness. The basement under that Chicago studio wasn't unique. I'm convinced there are similar setups throughout the music industry, hidden spaces where ancient entities make deals with modern artists, trading fame for souls and using popular music to influence human culture on a massive scale. Kanye's public struggles with mental health, his controversial statements, his apparently erratic behavior, They make more sense when viewed as symptoms of someone fighting supernatural possession, rather than simple bipolar disorder or personality issues. He was trying to break free from something that had been controlling his mind and creativity for years. His resistance came at a tremendous personal cost, but it may have been the only way to reclaim his authentic self. The music industry has always been about influence and power, but what I witness suggests that some of that influence comes from sources beyond human understanding. Artists who achieve massive success and then struggle with identity, authenticity, and mental health may be dealing with more than just fame and pressure. They may be fighting for their souls.